Why was one of history's most legendary commanders driven to suicide on a dark forest road by the very state for which he battled from front to front for years? Throughout this documentary, the path of an ordinary young man who did not belong to the military aristocracy was traced, revealing how he emerged from the bloody trenches and freezing mountains of the First World War to become the most feared armored commander of the Third Reich. The glorious rise of the legendary Desert Fox, who was born in the scorching deserts of North Africa and left Allied armies helpless through relentless tank battles, was witnessed. Subsequently, on the shores of Normandy, where the tide of the war shifted, his military genius, in the face of approaching absolute ruin, and ultimately, his tragic end entangled within the dark web of treason of the July 20th plot, were brought to light. At the conclusion of this narrative, the stark reality was fully grasped. How a national hero, whom even his enemies could not defeat on the battlefields, was ruthlessly eradicated by his own dictator's paranoia of loyalty and buried into history with a fabricated state funeral. If this journey through the heavy and shadowed pages of history was enjoyed, leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel was gently suggested. Furthermore, viewers were kindly asked to express their valuable thoughts and recommendations regarding this profound historical tragedy in the comments section. Now, the doors to those turbulent years, when the winds blew from the North African deserts toward the cold coasts of Europe, were gently opened, and a return was made to that very first day where the legend took root, to the quiet streets of Württemberg. On November 15th, 1891, at a time when Europe's industrial transformation was accelerating, Johannes Erwin Rommel was born. His birthplace was Heidenheim an der Brenz, a quiet and unassuming town located within the borders of Württemberg in southern Germany. His family was entirely of civilian origin. His father was a schoolmaster. He remained completely outside the aristocratic Junker class, a land-owning nobility with deep-rooted military traditions that had formed the backbone of the German army for centuries. In their home, it was not the echoes of military victories that prevailed, but the discipline of education and civilian life. Influenced by this civilian atmosphere, young Rommel's early years were spent not poring over maps or weapons, but harboring dreams of engineering and mathematics. His mind dwelt on the harmony of mechanical gears, the operating principles of engines, and the graceful glide of zeppelins across the sky. In his early years, he drew his own glider blueprints, made calculations, and was filled with the desire to forge a life as an engineer. However, his father's disciplined, decisive, and uncompromising guidance completely cut off this engineering path. The family's decision was absolute. The young man would join the army. In 1910, leaving his civilian dreams behind, he stepped through the doors of the 124th Württemberg Infantry Regiment as an officer cadet. His life was now shaped by uniforms, a strict chain of command, and grueling physical drills. Following his basic training, he was sent to the Royal War Academy in Danzig to build a professional foundation for his military career. Beneath the harsh winds of the Baltic Sea, he received intensive instruction in infantry tactics, map reading, and troop deployment. Through the strong work ethic he demonstrated there, he successfully completed his officer training. Commissioned with the rank of lieutenant, he returned directly to his own regiment, joining the ranks of his brothers in arms. Shortly after Lieutenant Rommel joined his unit, in the summer of 1914, the First World War, a conflict that would devastate Europe and the world, broke out. Assassinations, diplomatic crises, and a succession of mobilization orders engulfed the entire continent. Rommel was a novice officer who had not yet seen the true bloody face of war. The German war machine rapidly mobilized. Military trains departed toward the west. The young officer, along with his regiment, was swiftly and directly deployed to the unforgiving reality of the French front. Lieutenant Rommel's war began in Fulfrey in the west of France, amid the dark and muddy terrain of the Argonne forest. The early months of the war brought a level of destruction humanity had never before witnessed. In these bloody trench battles, where artillery shells tore through the sky, trees were uprooted, and the earth was reduced to massive craters, the young officer experienced his first fierce engagements. The static, motionless, and lethal nature of the trenches fundamentally shattered his perception of warfare. In September 1914, while advancing with his unit through dense fog and heavy artillery fire, he became separated from the main force. Moving through the dense woodland, virtually surrounded, he suddenly came face to face with 3 French soldiers. Instead of retreating or surrendering, he fixed his bayonet to his rifle and charged directly at the enemy without hesitation. With this sudden and ferocious bayonet charge, he single-handedly incapacitated the 3 French soldiers. However, during this violent clash, he was shot in the left leg, suffering his first combat wound. This extraordinary display of courage and initiative did not escape the notice of the German High Command, and shortly thereafter, he was awarded the Iron Cross, 2nd class. Following his recovery, Rommel's military destiny took a new direction. He was pulled away from the static trench warfare of the Western Front, stretching for miles and equating to suicide for both sides. He was specifically transferred for mountain warfare to the freezing cold of the Carpathian Mountains on the Romanian front. This geographical shift marked the awakening of his military genius. Amidst the steep slopes and deep valleys of the Romanian mountains, he utterly rejected the traditional, suicidal mass infantry charges he had witnessed on the Western Front. Instead of mounting direct assaults on enemy lines and suffering heavy casualties, he chose to exploit the natural advantages the terrain offered. Utilizing the pitch-black darkness of the night, the dense fog blanketing the valleys, and the blind spots unseen by enemy observation posts, he advanced his unit silently. He bypassed the enemy lines and first applied, then perfected, his infiltration tactics, slipping directly into their rear guard at the most unexpected moments on this grueling battlefield. Thanks to his mastery of this deadly new infiltration strategy, he was soon dispatched to the Italian front. In the autumn of 1917, during the massive offensive known to history as the Battle of Caporetto, he served within the Württemberg Mountain Battalion. Rommel, alongside a handful of mountain commandos under his command, pierced the seemingly impenetrable Italian lines and infiltrated miles deep into the enemy's logistical arteries. This infiltration maneuver evolved into one of the most extraordinary endurance tests in military history. Alongside his soldiers, he executed a relentless 50-hour continuous operation in freezing temperatures and across rugged cliffs, with almost no sleep, and conserving their ammunition to the utmost. He scaled the summit of the strategic Mount Matajur, standing 1,640 meters tall. Through psychological pressure and brilliant flanking maneuvers, he paralyzed the Italian forces, holding the mountain's peak and slopes, despite being heavily outnumbered. Without firing scarcely a single bullet, he captured an entire mountain range and took over 9,000 Italian soldiers prisoner, leaving them in utter shock. This unprecedented and massive outflanking operation, shaped purely by the initiative of a single officer, sent shockwaves through the German headquarters. A mere infantry officer single-handedly forcing an army-sized enemy into surrender opened the doors of the empire for him. Following this strategic victory, Rommel was personally awarded the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, the highest and most prestigious military decoration of the German army, an honor traditionally reserved for Prussian kings and noble generals. The First World War concluded in the autumn of 1918 with the decisive and absolute defeat of the German Empire. The map of Europe was redrawn, and the severe terms of the Treaty of Versailles, dictated by the victors, descended upon Germany like a nightmare. One of the most devastating clauses of this treaty was the military restrictions aimed at crippling the colossal German war machine. The imperial army, consisting of millions of soldiers, was disbanded, and the newly formed Reichswehr, German army, was limited to a strict cadre of only 100,000 men. While thousands of commissioned officers were discharged and forced to return to civilian life, Rommel, owing to his extraordinary battlefield successes and the Pour le Mérite resting around his neck, became one of the few officers who managed to remain within this diminished and elite army roster. In the immediate aftermath of the war, with the establishment of the Weimar Republic, Germany was plunged into massive political and economic chaos. Inflation ravaged the streets while far-right paramilitary groups and communist militias engaged in bloody clashes in town squares. While many officers within the army were drawn into this political turmoil, Rommel kept strictly aloof from civilian politics, street violence, and ideological polarization. He devoted all his attention and energy to a single focal point: his profession and military training. During the years of peace, he firmly believed the army needed to prepare for future conflicts. To this end, he took on the role of an infantry instructor at the prestigious military academies in Dresden and Potsdam. Throughout these years, spent in classrooms and on drill grounds, he synthesized the static trench hell of the First World War with the mobile warfare concept he had executed in the mountains. He instructed the new generation of officers and military cadets on exercising initiative even under heavy fire, infiltration tactics, and the nuances of mobile warfare. He reshaped classical German military doctrine with his own field experiences. During his years as an instructor, he did not settle for merely teaching classes. He meticulously compiled the detailed diaries he kept during the First World War, the harrowing experiences he endured in the trenches, and the assault sketches he had drawn with his own hands on the battlefield. As a result of this years-long editorial effort, he published his book, Infanterie greift an, Infantry Attacks, in 1937, committing his tactical genius to paper. From the moment of its publication, the book transcended being a mundane and tedious military textbook. Its narrative fluidity, its unvarnished reflection of the reality of war, and its portrayal of events through the eyes of a frontline officer captivated civilian readers as well. In a short time, it achieved monumental commercial success across Germany, with hundreds of thousands of copies printed, becoming one of Europe's most widely read military texts. In an era when war was looming and new mechanized armies were being built, this work, which blended infantry tactics with a dynamic and audacious philosophy of mobile warfare, landed directly on Adolf Hitler's desk. The dictator, reading the book intently, was mesmerized by the author's battlefield composure, his rejection of obsolete tactics, and his understanding of leadership. This theoretical triumph of Rommel drew Hitler's direct attention and profound admiration. The fact that Rommel did not hail from the arrogant and traditional Prussian officer class, but on the contrary, possessed an ordinary civilian background, further deepened Hitler's sympathy and trust toward him. Disturbed by the elitist attitudes of the old generals, Hitler viewed this brilliant and loyal officer, risen from the ranks of the common people, as the ideal military archetype for his regime. The first personal and close contacts between the two began during this period, grounded in this mutual strategic relationship of trust, forged at the pinnacle of the army and politics. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, as German armored units rapidly crossed the Polish border, the Second World War officially began. While the map of Europe went up in flames once again, Adolf Hitler entrusted the security of his personal headquarters, from which he directed the war, directly to Erwin Rommel. Appointed as the commander of the Führer Führer Escort Battalion, Rommel found himself away from the hot lines of combat during this critical period, standing at the very epicenter of absolute political and military power. Throughout the Polish campaign, the dictator monitored developments at the front from his massive, specially designed armored train equipped with anti-aircraft batteries, named America. The entire command and administration of this mobile military headquarters, determining its route, protecting it against air raids, and establishing its logistical links with army commanders at the front, rested entirely on Rommel's shoulders. He managed the movement planning of this train, threading through ruined Polish cities and smoldering front lines, with flawless military discipline. This assignment at headquarters did not merely afford him the opportunity to sit at the table where the highest level decisions were made. It also provided him the vantage point to witness firsthand the German army's newly deployed doctrine, the Blitzkrieg, lightning war. He grasped how independent armored divisions, backed by dive bombers, paralyzed enemy lines, realizing that wars were no longer won in static trenches, but through motorized speed. Following Poland's total collapse in a matter of weeks and the sealing of the German victory, his mission was successfully concluded. Upon their return, Hitler, expressing his satisfaction with the headquarters commander's impeccable service, personally asked Rommel what assignment he desired. Until that day, Rommel's entire career had been built upon traditional infantry training and infiltration operations in mountainous terrain. He possessed no formal training or field experience regarding the technical specifications of tanks, armored unit logistics, or large-scale mechanized command. Yet, he had comprehended the devastating and unstoppable power of mechanized warfare. Without hesitation, he directly requested the command of a panzer division. This audacious request sent deep tremors through the traditional and rigid hierarchy of the German army. The arrogant and conservative Prussian-born generals of the German High Command, OKW, vehemently objected to this plea, arguing that such a vital and technical role could not be left in unqualified hands. In the eyes of the generals, he was merely an infantry officer lacking an aristocratic pedigree, someone who had only taught infantry tactics at the military academy, and who was now attempting to climb the ranks through political patronage. The command of the armored divisions, the most elite force of the army, they believed, ought to remain the monopoly of seasoned cavalry and tank generals. However, this fierce storm brewed by the generals collided with Hitler's absolute authority and dissipated. The dictator brushed aside all military objections and warnings regarding merit from the high command. With an unequivocal and unquestionable order, he cleared the path for this loyal officer, whom he held in high regard. Amidst the tense atmosphere where plans for the invasion of France, Fall Gelb, were being drawn up, and preparations for a massive westward offensive were underway, Erwin Rommel was officially appointed commander of the 7th Panzer Division in February 1940. A new, dark chapter unfolded in his military career. He was no longer a commander of muddy trenches, but of the steel armor that would crush Europe. At dawn on May 10, 1940, the colossal offensive that would forever alter the destiny of Western Europe commenced as the Fall Gelb, Case Yellow plan was set in motion. The French High Command held an unshakable belief that the Ardennes region, composed of dense forests and steep valleys, was impassable by mechanized forces. Yet, the 7th Panzer Division, under Rommel's command, shattered this strategic delusion. As steel treads crushed centuries-old trees, a massive military convoy poured swiftly and unstoppably through the narrow forest roads, striking straight for the heart of France. The first major obstacle to this lightning advance was the deep and perilous Meuse River. For the German armor to cross the river, pontoon bridges had to be constructed with utmost haste. However, French artillery and heavy machine gun nests, entrenched on the opposite bank, rained death upon the German combat engineers. Suffering heavy casualties, the engineers faltered, the advance ground to a halt, and the effort to establish a bridgehead dissolved into chaos. Rommel refused to watch the situation unfold from afar in his command vehicle. He plunged directly into the front lines, diving among his soldiers on the riverbank where enemy fire was fiercest. Wading personally into the frigid waters of the river, he directed the placement of the bridge pontoons. With bullets ricocheting around him, he personally showed his men exactly where to direct their heavy weapons fire. Witnessing their commander at the very forefront, the resilience of the German troops surged. Laying down an intense volley of return fire, they paralyzed the enemy defenses and secured the crossing of the Meuse River. Following the river crossing, the 7th Panzer Division accelerated its pace even further into the interior of France. Yet, this relentless advance collided with an unexpected wall on the plains of Arras on May 21, 1940. The British Expeditionary Force launched a surprise counterattack at this point of the front with their heavily armored Matilda tanks. The Germans' standard 37mm anti-tank guns fired, but the shells bounced harmlessly off the thick steel armor of the British tanks and scattered. The German infantry lines faced the imminent danger of being overrun, and panic set in. In this critical moment, Rommel made a lethal tactical decision rarely witnessed on the battlefield. He ordered long-barreled 88mm anti-aircraft, flak, guns, originally designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers under normal conditions, to be brought to the front. He lowered the barrels from the sky to the ground, positioning them at a horizontal angle. For the first time in history, these colossal artillery pieces were fired as direct, horizontal anti-tank weapons. The tremendous velocity and destructive power of the 88mm shells pierced the thick armor of the British tanks as if it were paper. The British armored assault, incinerated within the blazing tanks, was bloodily halted thanks to this improvised decision. Following the resolution of the crisis at Arras, the unit's speed reached an extraordinary level. To prevent the enemy from intercepting their radio lines and triangulating their position, Rommel ordered strict radio silence for his division. All radios were shut down. His troops advanced with such speed, depth, and isolation that the fleeing French army was utterly incapable of forming a defensive line. Even more strikingly, the German high command in Berlin itself lost track of exactly where this massive, armored division was located on the map. Suddenly appearing in a French town only to vanish miles away within hours, this terrifying force was dubbed the Ghost Division, Gespenster Division, by both its enemies and allies. The Ghost Division flowed relentlessly to the west. Leaving the final pockets of resistance behind, it reached the shores of the English Channel. The target was the strategically critical port city of Cherbourg. The port's defenses entirely collapsed in the face of the 7th Panzer Division's merciless siege, with the city's commanders hoisting the white flag of surrender. Rommel took thousands of prisoners and captured a colossal port. The invasion of France was successfully concluded with this decisive victory. The final months of 1940 and the beginning of 1941 marked a period when the balance of power was completely shattered on North African soil. Following the campaign, it launched to expand its colonial dominance in the region. The Italian 10th Army faced a sudden and crushing counteroffensive from British forces. Operation Compass, executed by the British, utterly shattered the Italian defensive lines in the desert. Unable to resist against heavy tanks and mobile infantry units, the Italian army was forced to retreat hundreds of kilometers across Cyrenaica. Crushed under the merciless heat of the desert and logistical impossibilities, the 10th Army suffered an absolute collapse, losing tens of thousands of its soldiers and hundreds of armored vehicles. Retreating as far as the coast of Tripoli, this force revealed the stark reality that the desert would be completely lost without Allied support. This decisive and sudden collapse in the southern Mediterranean caused grave concern within the German High Command in Berlin. The total end of Italy's presence in North Africa meant the loss of all strategic advantages of the Axis powers in the Mediterranean basin. Following this critical development, the German military leadership prepared an urgent intervention plan to save its ally in the Mediterranean from utter annihilation and to stabilize the front. In accordance with this plan, a new and specialized mechanized force with high maneuverability in desert conditions was formed. This unit was named the Deutsches Afrika Korps, or the German Africa Corps. The Corps was composed of a small number of highly disciplined armored divisions and motorized infantry units. The name chosen by the command echelon for this new and dangerous mission was Erwin Rommel, who had made a name for himself with his aggressive tactics during the invasion of France. In his capacity as the commander of the Armored Corps, Rommel set foot in the port of Tripoli on February 12, 1941. The moment he reached the port, utter disarray and demoralization prevailed in the desert. The Italian troops were completely scattered, and the British advance toward Tripoli became a matter of time. Rommel immediately began to organize the first German troops disembarking on the shore and the existing Italian forces. The German High Command, OKW, evaluated the unforgiving geography and endless sand plains of North Africa through the eyes of its officers, took into account the fragility of the supply lines maintained across the Mediterranean, and adopted a cautious strategy. The official orders transmitted to Rommel were exceptionally clear and limited. Citing the logistical difficulties of Africa, the High Command ordered him to remain strictly on the defensive, to establish a line around the Gulf of Sirte, to await British offensives, and absolutely forbade him from engaging in any large-scale forward operation. In the eyes of Berlin, this corps was merely a temporary defensive force meant solely to protect its ally. However, Erwin Rommel put into motion the audacious principles of mobile warfare to which he had remained loyal throughout his military career. He completely disregarded this strict defensive order given to him. He noticed that the British forces were exhausted due to prolonged operations. Their supply lines were stretched, and a portion of their frontline troops had been redeployed to other fronts. While his troops had just disembarked at the port and barely completed their logistical preparations, he immediately launched an offensive against the weak British lines in the Cyrenaica region without even giving them a chance to regroup. This sudden and unpredictable forward surge entirely dismantled the static structure of the North African front. This unexpected armored offensive, initiated by Rommel at El Agheila, soon transformed into an unstoppable lightning advance. The steel treads of the Afrika Korps relentlessly flowed eastward, carving through the endless desert sands. Astonished by what had hit them, the British forces were pushed back hundreds of kilometers across the desert, suffering heavy casualties. Accustomed to classic and static front-line warfare, the Allied armies were left helpless against this force that constantly outflanked them, attacked their supply lines, and vanished abruptly into desert storms. Rommel's rapid, cunning, and completely unpredictable armored maneuvers, adapting instantly to the merciless rules of the desert, earned him that legendary title whispered with both respect and fear even by his enemies, the Desert Fox. As the advance continued, the target became the strategically vital port city of Tobruk, the lifeblood of all military operations in North Africa. With its deep waters and vast harbor, this city, the absolute logistical key to the Desert War, was entirely besieged by German armor by land in April 1941. Rommel believed he could fell the city with a swift armored assault, just as he had done in France. However, Tobruk was surrounded by deep anti-tank ditches, bunkers, barbed wire, and boundless minefields. The Australian troops defending the city resisted the assaults of the German panzers with unparalleled stubbornness. The defenders, lying in ambush under the scorching daytime heat, infiltrated German trenches at night, inflicting heavy casualties. The Desert Fox realized that mobile warfare tactics were ineffective against a well-fortified static defensive line with the sea at its back. Throughout this bloody and grueling siege lasting for months, the German forces experienced their first heavy failures in the Desert War. Tobruk did not fall for months. By November 1941, the winds of the desert shifted direction once again. Regrouping at the Egyptian border and reinforced with new American-made tanks and fresh colonial troops, the British forces launched the massive Operation Crusader to regain the initiative and break the steel siege at Tobruk. Hundreds of British and German tanks clashed head-on for a colossal battle across the vast desert plains. Amidst the sandstorms and dense artillery smoke, highly complex and chaotic, maneuver warfare ensued for weeks. The clashes became so intertwined that on some days, it became entirely unclear who was encircling whom or where any given unit was located. Tanks were reduced to heaps of wreckage. Both sides suffered heavy human and material losses in this deadly armored chess game. By December, the situation for the German army became critical. With the sinking of German supply ships in the Mediterranean by Allied aircraft, the fuel, water, and ammunition lines were severed. Rommel had to save his army, which was nearing the point of exhaustion, out of ammunition, and devoid of maneuverability, from total annihilation. With a bitter decision, he completely lifted the siege of Tobruk, which had lasted for months and claimed the blood of thousands of soldiers. He temporarily withdrew the Afrika Korps to the Gazala line further west in order to recover and gather lost strength. The Afrika Korps, having retreated to the Gazala line, did not melt away and perish in the depths of the desert as the British had hoped. On the contrary, in this merciless and silent corner of the desert, Rommel reorganized his troops with extraordinary speed. He cleverly rationed the limited fuel and ammunition arriving from the supply lines, and restored a large portion of the damaged panzers back to combat readiness. In January 1942, at a moment when the enemy believed him to be completely neutralized and helpless, he suddenly launched a surprise counteroffensive toward the east. This audacious move placed the lost initiative in the desert firmly back into the hands of the German armor once and for all. Following months of mutual preparations and buildups, the Battle of Gazala, one of the largest, most complex, and deadliest armored clashes military history had ever witnessed, erupted with full fury in May 1942. Two colossal armies collided beneath the scorching heat of the desert. The epicenter of the clashes became a hellish zone dubbed the Cauldron by the soldiers. Within this narrow and mined area, armored units threw themselves at one another amidst blinding sandstorms, at moments when visibility dropped to a mere few meters. Tank barrels and heavy artillery batteries fired at a deafening rhythm from distances close enough to almost touch one another. Black smoke rising from exploding ammunition dumps and burning heaps of steel draped over the battlefield like a dark shroud. The British forces laid down massive minefields, stretching for kilometers in front of their defensive lines, designed to protect even their own tanks, viewing them as impenetrable. Launching a direct assault on this line was absolute suicide. To overcome this lethal obstacle, Rommel made a highly risky decision that would determine the fate of the battle. Under the cover of night, he directed the main body of his armored units from the southernmost tip of these massive minefields, drawing a wide arc deep into the desert. Through this immense flanking maneuver, he completely bypassed the enemy lines and pierced the allegedly impenetrable British defenses directly from the rear at a wholly unexpected moment. The greatest obstacle before this large-scale encirclement operation was the Bir Hakeim Oasis, a strategic water source and key point in the middle of the desert. This small oasis was stubbornly defended by Free French forces. Despite being completely surrounded by German tanks and running out of provisions, the French soldiers refused to surrender for weeks. To break this resistance that was slowing his general advance, Rommel concentrated all his available artillery power and diving Stuka dive bombers directly upon this small pinpoint. With thousands of tons of bombs, the oasis was literally wiped off the map, and the resistance was bloodily crushed. With the fall of Bir Hakeim in flames, the breakthrough operation achieved absolute success. Wasting no time, Rommel rapidly turned his panzers eastward, directing them toward the strategic city of Tobruk, which he had failed to capture the previous year despite a bloody siege lasting for months. Encircled from the rear, its logistical lines severed and morally collapsed, the Tobruk defense could not hold against this sudden and crushing assault by the German forces. On June 21, 1942, along with more than 30,000 prisoners and the massive ammunition depots amassed by the British in the desert, the city of Tobruk fell definitively into German hands. The staggering fall of this greatest fortress and logistical hub of North Africa was met with immense celebratory fervor in Berlin. Following the news of this absolute victory from Africa, Adolf Hitler issued a special order to be implemented immediately. He promoted Erwin Rommel to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall, Field Marshal, the highest and most respected military rank in the German army. Coming from outside the military aristocracy, the Desert Fox reached the absolute, undisputed zenith of his career, his power, and his legend. Bolstered by the staggering psychological superiority and strategic victory forged by the capture of Tobruk, the German armor did not halt. Refusing to give the British army any opportunity to regroup, the Desert Fox crossed the borders and continued his relentless advance deep into Egypt, toward the strategic Suez Canal, the lifeblood of the empire. The panzer divisions arrived at the very gates of Alexandria and Cairo. However, this continuous, deep, and unstoppable advance carried the seeds of a massive logistical disaster within itself. Stretching for thousands of kilometers, the supply lines of the German army reached their breaking point. Operating from the island of Malta, positioned as a strategic fortress in the middle of the Mediterranean, British bombers and submarines hunted German logistical convoys en route from Italian ports to North Africa day and night. Transport ships carrying tons of fuel, water, and ammunition were buried in the dark waters of the Mediterranean. These disruptions gradually paralyzed the German tanks and motorized units in the middle of the desert. The panzers now found themselves bogged down in the searing desert sands, not because of enemy fire, but due to completely empty fuel tanks. A severe shortage of water and ammunition broke out among the soldiers. In July 1942, the German troops, nearing the point of exhaustion from fatigue and thirst, reached the vicinity of the El Alamein railway station, just a short distance from Alexandria. Here, the First Battle of El Alamein erupted. The British forces utilized the geographical structure of the region flawlessly to their advantage. An impenetrable defensive line was constructed in this bottleneck, bordered to the south by the Cutera Depression, filled with swamps and sand dunes impassable by armored vehicles, and to the north by the Mediterranean Sea. Rommel's mobile flanking maneuvers, relying on drawing wide arcs around the enemy, which he had masterfully applied in desert warfare until that day, became utterly impossible due to this geographical constriction. Faced with the stiffening British defense, massive minefields, and intense artillery fire, the German offensive ground to a bloody halt at the El Alamein line. The war transitioned from rapid tank duels in the open desert to a static and deadly war of trenches and attrition. During this forced stalemate and the phase where both sides dug into the trenches, a critical appointment that would alter the fate of the war took place within the British command echelon. General Bernard Montgomery took command of the British Eighth Army. Unlike his predecessors, Montgomery did not engage in any hasty or unplanned offensives. Before facing the Desert Fox, he initiated an absolute preparation phase. During this waiting period lasting for months, with the direct support of the accelerating industrial production power of the United States, he executed a massive buildup behind the front. Hundreds of new American-made Sherman tanks, thousands of tons of heavy artillery ammunition, trucks, and fresh colonial soldiers were transported to the front. While the Germans struggled for a single drop of fuel and water on the other side of the line, Montgomery elevated the material and troop strength of the British Eighth Army to crushing colossal proportions. In the desert, that heavy era began, where it was no longer military genius, but industry and logistics that would speak. On the night of October 23, 1942, the darkness of the Egyptian desert was engulfed in a blinding illumination as thousands of British guns fired simultaneously. The massive offensive that General Montgomery had been preparing for months began with an unparalleled artillery barrage that tore through the sky. The Second Battle of El Alamein descended upon the Afrika Korps as a lethal rain of steel under absolute Allied armored and aerial supremacy. The heavy bombardment lasting for days in the sand trenches and the relentless, ceaseless waves of British tank assaults decisively altered the course of the war. Depleted of fuel, out of ammunition, and completely stripped of their air support in the skies, the German defensive lines gradually collapsed under this massive material force. Panzers were struck where they stood, turning into balls of flame. As this absolute collapse unfolded at the front, a coded telegram from Berlin, directly from Adolf Hitler, reached the headquarters. The dictator dispatched an absolute, uncompromising, and ruthless order to his army in Africa, stating, "Victory or death, not a single step back will be taken." However, Rommel saw that the reality on the battlefield was vastly different from the map rooms in Berlin. He realized that if his troops remained in position, the Afrika Korps would suffer an absolute massacre, and tens of thousands of his soldiers would die in vain or be taken prisoner in the desert. Making one of the most difficult decisions of his military career, he directly defied this strict order from the Führer. To save his soldiers and his last remaining armor, he immediately implemented the decision for a general retreat. This act of insubordination and the decision to retreat initiated the final and most agonizing phase of the North African War. A desperate tactical retreat stretching from Egypt to Tunisia commenced, lasting for months and bleeding out step by step in the desert. Under the relentless pursuit of the British Eighth Army, the Afrika Korps marched hundreds of kilometers westward, constantly fighting rearguard actions. Tank wreckage and thousands of soldiers were left behind at every abandoned defensive line. In the final stages of the retreat, in February 1943, Rommel demonstrated his tactical genius one last time. He launched a sudden counterattack at the Battle of Kasserine Pass against the American troops who were well-equipped but entirely inexperienced in desert warfare, having recently arrived at the front following the Allied landings in West Africa. Catching the American armor and infantry lines off guard, he dealt them a final and extremely heavy blow. However, this regional victory was not enough to change the overall trajectory of the war. The Desert Fox's personal health issues, combined with the stress and exhaustion of months of desert warfare, reached a critical point. Under the completely shattered logistical networks, supply ships lost at sea, and the massive Allied pincer movement created by the British, advancing from the east, and the Americans pressing from the west, resistance in North Africa became mathematically impossible. As the encirclement completely tightened, on March 9, 1943, before the impending absolute captivity, he was permanently recalled from Africa by Adolf Hitler. Erwin Rommel, who had once stood at the gates of Egypt, boarded his plane as an ailing and defeated commander and returned to Europe. The blood-soaked African saga of the Desert Fox, fraught with legends, closed forever on that day. Following the absolute downfall in the scorching sands of North Africa and the ultimate loss of the Africa Course, Erwin Rommel's role on the stage of war changed for a brief period. In the middle of 1943, in a geography vastly different from the deserts, he took command of Army Group B stationed in northern Italy. This assignment was a relatively quiet period of pause for him after the high tempo of desert warfare. However, the noose was rapidly tightening for the Third Reich, and it was militarily and strategically impossible for one of the most renowned commanders of the war to remain in the background for long. By November 1943, the center of gravity of the war and all the anxieties of the German High Command shifted to the west. Berlin deeply felt the approaching footsteps of a massive and inevitable Allied invasion looming on the horizon against the shores of Western Europe. To bolster the defenses of Fortress Europe against this mortal threat, and to build up the fortification line that Nazi propaganda dubbed the Atlantic Wall, which in reality remained unfinished, Rommel was appointed as a special inspector. His new mission was to inspect the thousands of kilometers of coastline facing the cold waters of the English Channel, and to implement a flawless plan that smothered the Allied invasion right on the beaches. From the very first day of his new assignment, Rommel personally inspected the western coastline of Europe from beginning to end, examining a vast line stretching from the shores of Denmark to the south of France. He walked for kilometers on windswept beaches alongside his officers. The sight he encountered as a result of his inspections was far removed from the myth of the impenetrable wall praised in Berlin. He saw that the existing defensive lines were extremely inadequate, weak, and scattered to stop the approaching massive Allied armada. Upon making this vital assessment, he immediately initiated a colossal fortification project requiring a human effort that completely altered the face of the coastline. By examining every single meter of the shores, he transformed the defense into a ruthless and lethal mechanism. Mobilizing workers and combat engineers to their absolute limits, he accelerated the construction of massive concrete bunkers designed to protect artillery batteries and machine gun nests from the heavy bombardment of Allied ships at an unprecedented pace. He planted deadly wooden obstacles known as Rommel's asparagus, which featured sharpened tips and were largely booby-trapped with explosives, along the coastline and the inland plains to tear apart airborne paratrooper and glider assaults before they even touched the ground. He did not settle for obstacles alone. By sowing the beaches, the shallow waters, and the probable invasion routes with millions of mines, he turned the western coasts of Europe into a massive and inescapable death trap for the Allied soldiers stepping ashore. Having personally experienced the crushing material, might, and particularly the absolute air superiority of the Allied armies in the unforgiving deserts of North Africa, Erwin Rommel held an entirely absolute conviction regarding the nature of the upcoming grand invasion. If the Allied forces stepped ashore and successfully established a secure beachhead on the European continent, Germany's chance of winning this war disappeared completely. In line with this unshakable belief, he built his entire defensive strategy upon a single, ruthless rule. The enemy had to be stopped directly on the shore, on the beaches where they set foot, within the first 24 hours of the landing, regardless of the cost. According to Rommel, those initial 24 hours became the longest day that determined the fate of the war for both the Allies and Germany. However, this rigid and uncompromising defensive conviction of Rommel created deep and irreparable strategic rifts between him and the highest figures of the German military hierarchy, particularly the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, and the founding theoretician of the armored forces, General Heinz Guderian. Rundstedt, hailing from the old and traditional Prussian school, advocated for keeping the German armored reserves amassed far away from the coastline, deep inland as a massive strategic reserve. According to Rundstedt's plan, once the main Allied landing point was definitively identified, these heavy panzer divisions launched a massed counteroffensive and crushed the enemy on the beach. Rommel fiercely opposed this classical doctrine of war. Drawing upon his bitter experiences in Africa, he predicted that it was physically impossible for massive armored units to travel hundreds of kilometers during daylight beneath a sky completely dominated by a massive Allied air superiority. He argued that the panzers faced decimation on the roads by British and American fighter planes before even reaching the front, and he therefore insisted on deploying the armored divisions directly at the points closest to the shore. These fierce doctrinal debates, lasting for weeks, practically split the command echelon in two and paralyzed the defensive preparations. This deep and unresolvable command crisis ultimately reached Berlin, landing directly on Adolf Hitler's desk. Instead of making a clear military decision between his two experienced generals, the dictator made a compromise decision that proved utterly dysfunctional on the field and ultimately yielded fatal consequences. He divided the armored divisions in two, giving a portion to Rommel and a portion to Rundstedt. Yet he dealt the heaviest blow by directly tying a massive reserve group composed of the strongest and most elite armored divisions to his own personal approval. Under this decision, when the invasion began, no commander in the field possessed the authority to move these critical panzer divisions even a single kilometer without the direct permission and order of the Führer in Berlin. The most powerful weapon of Fortress Europe was locked in place by the bureaucratic chains of the dictator himself. The early days of June 1944 witnessed the most severe storms of recent years across the English Channel. Dense gray clouds blanketed the sky, and ferocious waves ruthlessly battered the French coast. German meteorological experts and military intelligence services in Western Europe reported that it was militarily impossible for the Allies to mount any large-scale naval or airborne operation under such adverse weather conditions. These definitive military reports created an atmosphere of great relief and complacency within the German defensive command echelon across Normandy. The possibility of a landing in the coming days was completely dismissed. The highest state of alert on the front was relaxed, and many division commanders even left their coastal positions for the interior to attend planned war-game military exercises. Seizing upon this temporary logistical and meteorological reprieve on the coast, Erwin Rommel decided to leave the front briefly, burdened by the immense exhaustion of months of superhuman coastal fortification efforts. On June 5th, he set out for his home in Herrlingen, Germany, to both celebrate the birthday of his wife Lucy, from whom he stayed away for a long time, and to discuss the military situation, especially the control of the panzer divisions, face to face with the dictator in Berlin. As the Desert Fox turned his back on the stormy English Channel and headed toward his homeland, he was completely oblivious to the fact that the greatest amphibious invasion to alter the course of history commenced in his absence mere hours later. In the early dark hours of the morning on June 6, 1944, The waters off the Normandy coast filled with the terrifying silhouettes of thousands of Allied ships emerging through the fog. Operation Overlord, the largest landing operation in military history, officially commenced with the earth-shattering roar of naval artillery tearing through the sky and bombs dropped from thousands of aircraft. As Allied soldiers battled the waves to press toward the beaches, the news of the invasion's commencement struck the German front headquarters in the west like a lightning bolt. Awakened by the ringing of the telephone in the early hours of the morning at his home in Herrlingen, Rommel was shaken by this definitive and staggering military report from the front. Upon receiving the news, he turned to his aides and announced that the great invasion definitely began in Normandy. Wasting no time, he embarked on a long, time-critical return journey, navigating stormy and perilous roads to reach his headquarters in France. While Rommel was on the road, the fateful moments of the entire war unfolded on the front line. Despite the massive minefields on the beaches and the intense machine gun fire pouring from concrete bunkers, the Allied forces managed to secure the bloody beachheads one by one and established safe bridgeheads there. Exactly during these critical hours, the command disaster that Rommel previously warned against repeatedly became a reality. The direct personal approval of the dictator in Berlin was required to release the strongest elite armored reserves held inland. However, Adolf Hitler was asleep, and his staff lacked the courage to wake him. Due to this bureaucratic bottleneck, a fatal delay lasting for hours occurred before the panzer divisions mobilized. When Rommel finally reached his front headquarters in France toward evening, the situation reached a point of no return. He made moves with his last ounce of strength to rally the collapsing defensive lines and organize the panzers to drive the enemy into the sea. Yet all his efforts were crushed beneath the relentless bombardments of the massive Allied air superiority that completely covered the sky. German armor was hunted down on the roads, fresh troops failed to reach the front, and the shores of Normandy were definitively lost. In the weeks following the landing, the resistance on the Normandy front turned into a bloody and relentless war of attrition for the German army. Facing the endless material might of the Allies, their fresh troops, and the continuous bombardments raining from the sky, the German defensive lines wore thinner with each passing day. The person who saw this hopeless and dark picture on the front most clearly was Erwin Rommel, who always placed military reality ahead of political ideology. Instead of concealing the absolute annihilation they faced, he submitted extremely pessimistic, realistic, and harsh reports to Berlin and directly to the dictator, stating that the war was militarily, definitively, and irreversibly lost. These uncompromising reports were met with immense fury at the Führer's headquarters. On July 17, 1944, returning from a routine inspection of the front line that turned into a bloodbath, Rommel's open-top staff car drove along a deserted road near the village of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. The absolute master of the skies was no longer the German Luftwaffe, but the Allied aircraft. This lone German staff car, speeding across the open terrain, was instantly spotted by British fighter planes patrolling the sky. Spitfire or Typhoon model fighter planes descended rapidly through the clouds like predators spotting their prey, entering a lethal dive. The bullets firing from the heavy machine guns of the aircraft turned the quiet village road into an inferno within seconds. Armor-piercing rounds caught the vehicle in a crossfire, and the staff driver at the wheel suffered severe injuries. Losing all control, the vehicle veered off the road at high speed, violently rolled over and shattered. Flung from the open vehicle by the tremendous force of the impact, Rommel struck the hard ground and sustained a very severe skull injury. Left with his face covered in blood and losing consciousness entirely, the commander was rushed to a military hospital with the help of nearby soldiers. The active command duty and the legendary odyssey on the battlefields of the Desert Fox, who once ruled armies in the African deserts and was the undisputed master of armored maneuvers, ended forever with this sudden and violent strike from the sky. On July 20th, 1944, the deep unrest within the Third Reich surfaced with a bloody explosion. The junta, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, took action upon seeing that the war was lost and Germany was being dragged into absolute ruin. Stauffenberg infiltrated the meeting room at Adolf Hitler's high-security Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia and planted a powerful time bomb beneath the oak table. Exploding with great violence, the bomb reduced the room to ruins and tore apart the surrounding officers. However, the thick leg of the heavy oak table shielded the dictator from the main shockwave of the blast. The assassination attempt failed, and the dictator emerged from beneath the rubble with only minor scratches, but with an unparalleled fury. The failure of the assassination attempt caused the Nazi regime to unleash a horrifying wave of vengeance across all echelons of the army. The Gestapo initiated a widespread, ruthless witch hunt to unravel the web of treason and eliminate even those who harbored the slightest sympathy against the regime. Thousands of officers, civilians, and politicians were taken from their homes in the middle of the night. The arrests spread in waves, reaching all the way to the highest command echelons of the military. These dark and bloody investigations soon extended to France, reaching the German military headquarters in Paris. The conspirator officers in Paris who supported the coup attempt and dared to arrest SS officers, particularly General Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel and Lieutenant Colonel Caesar von Hofacker, were thrown into the dark dungeons of the Gestapo. Interrogations under severe and inhumane torture lasted for weeks. In these dim dungeons, where wills broke and pain eradicated all forms of loyalty, a highly critical and staggering name was written into the interrogation records: Erwin Rommel. Whether Rommel actively or directly participated in this bloody conspiracy, and whether he was aware that the bomb would be planted, remained a historical mystery. His priority was always his soldiers on the front, and he advocated the military overthrow of Hitler rather than political assassinations. However, the secret documents seized by the Gestapo placed him at the exact center of this dark web, regardless of his intentions. On the cabinet list of the new German government, planned to be established following a successful coup, Rommel's name appeared with the title of the leader respected by the people and head of state. The conspirators calculated that they needed the prestige of a colossal national hero like the Desert Fox to persuade the German people and the army into accepting a new government. These bloody interrogation records and secret coup documents featuring Rommel's underlined name were placed directly on Adolf Hitler's desk in Berlin. The dictator saw the name of his most loyal and globally recognized general, whom he created for years through his own propaganda machine, at the very top of the treason list. Completely poisoned in mind by the paranoia of betrayal, Hitler entirely lost his trust in his greatest commander, whom even his enemies could not defeat on the battlefields in that exact second, and he made the resolute, uncompromising decision to eliminate him. On the morning of October 14th, 1944, The cold autumn winds blew through the quiet streets of the town of Herrlingen. Erwin Rommel rested at his home in this peaceful town with his family, spending his convalescence period for the severe wounds he received in Normandy. Yet, this profound silence was completely shattered at noon by the engine sound of a military vehicle appearing at the door of the house. Hitler's special envoys, General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Ernst Maesel, arrived at the house in Herrlingen with strict orders received from Berlin. Simultaneous with the arrival of the generals, plainclothes Gestapo agents and SS troops silently surrounded the house with extensive security measures. All exits were blocked, and the house's entire connection to the outside world was severed instantly. Feeling the dark weight of the approaching end, Rommel wore his military uniform and greeted his guests in his own study. During this brief and ice-cold meeting that took place behind closed doors, the generals presented Rommel with a strict two-option ultimatum directly from the Führer, from which there was no turning back. The first option entailed a ruthless scenario of revenge. According to this, Rommel had to accept facing trial at the People's Court, Volksgerichtshof, known for its cruelty, on charges of high treason against the state and participation in the July 20th assassination. If this scenario materialized, not only was he executed with his honor shattered, but his wife Lucy and his son Manfred were also arrested by the Gestapo and sent directly to concentration camps. The second option was a quiet death aimed at preserving the regime's prestige in the eyes of the public. It was stated that if he committed suicide by swallowing the cyanide capsule presented to him, his family remained completely untouched, and all security guarantees were provided. Furthermore, a massive state funeral befitting heroes was promised to be held following his death. The Desert Fox made this choice far heavier than the most difficult decisions he made on the battlefields throughout his life in a matter of seconds. To protect his wife, his son, and the loyal aides he fought shoulder to shoulder with for years from the wrath of the Gestapo, he chose suicide without hesitation. Accepting this dark offer was the only way to save his military honor and the lives of his family. Stepping out of the room, he said his final goodbyes to his wife Lucy and his son Manfred. His face bore no sign of fear or remorse. Only a heavy and silent acceptance, brought upon by the approaching absolute end, dominated the atmosphere. Rommel took his field marshal's baton in his hand, put on his cap, stepped out of the house, and boarded the general's staff car, waiting at the door. Shortly after leaving Herrlingen and turning onto a deserted and forested road in the direction of Ulm, the vehicle pulled over to the side of the road and stopped. General Maesel and the vehicle's driver stepped outside. Rommel was left alone in the back seat with General Burgdorf. Just a few minutes later, he ended his life by biting into the cyanide capsule given to him inside the vehicle. The life of the legendary commander who dragged Allied armies after him for years and whose strategies became lessons in military academies ended not by an honorable enemy bullet on the battlefield, but by a poison presented by the dictatorship he served for years on a quiet forest road. Immediately following Rommel's ending of his life on a quiet forest road, the Nazi propaganda machine and Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels stepped in at once to cover up this political assassination. The regime meticulously concealed the reality that its most famous general, who turned into an invincible legend in the eyes of the public, was forced into suicide or accused of treason against the state. An official bulletin was released to the German people, the armed forces, and the global public. In this bulletin, It was announced that the Desert Fox suffered a severe heart attack and passed away due to the wounds he received as a result of the heavy air raid he was subjected to on the Normandy front on July 17th. This absolute lie was a flawless state fabrication designed to maintain public morale and preserve the shaken trust in the dictatorship during a dark period when the war was being lost on every front. When the calendar showed October 18th, 1944, a massive, somber, and exceptionally grandiose state funeral was held in the city of Ulm, completely under the control of the regime. The ceremony grounds and the streets were adorned from top to bottom with giant swastika flags, black mourning ribbons, and military wreaths. Adolf Hitler did not personally attend the funeral of the general he killed by his own order. However, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was present at the ceremony representing him. Standing by the swastika-draped coffin, Rundstedt delivered a completely fabricated and pre-written farewell speech, praising Rommel's unshakable loyalty to his Führer. Although Rommel's wife Lucy and his son Manfred knew the truth, they silently took their places in this dark theatrical play in order to survive. The most respected, most capable, and most globally recognized soldier of the Third Reich was ruthlessly eliminated by his own regime, which he served for years running from front to front. Yet he found no peace even after his death. He was utilized one last time by the same regime as a myth of heroism, a hollowed-out tool of propaganda. Following the military ceremony, Rommel's body was cremated, and his ashes were interred in the Herrlingen cemetery. This tragic life story, which was born in the scorching sands of North Africa, broken on the Atlantic shores of Europe, and ultimately met its end in the dark corridors of treason of its own state, closed into the pages of history forever, alongside that false state funeral. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.